Hi there, I'm Thomas Hislop, the creative director of The Pale Beyond, and today we're going to get into how we designed the crew of the expedition, as well as the ship itself, and begun into the art direction process on The Pale Beyond.
Characters started as like a list of job roles. We had a list of all of the different kinds of jobs on expeditions and jobs on like sailing ships at the time. That was sort of where we started with characters before we really had any like personalities. So whenever it came to the first character designs, I mostly focused on costume. And that was where I started introducing elements that maybe were ahistorical, where I started looking at slightly more fantasy elements. I took some inspiration from the structure of like medieval and Viking clothing, specifically Vikings because they were like seafaring people. So I wanted to have that, and also the inspiration of like slightly more superstitious, fantastical aesthetic to separate the sailing from the landborn folk, where like the landborn are super like British, almost military. The seafaring folk were more to do with like superstition, life at the sea, and that sort of thing. So they were more fantasy focused. Whenever we had the job roles, the costumes they started with what was functional for those jobs. So like Kurt is a navigator, so he had a spyglass and stuff. And we also designed a few of them based on real life explorers, which helped a lot with the original look and the prompt. So like Kurt is the big celebrity man, so he's very inspired by Peter Freuchen. And there's this very famous photograph of Peter with his massive fur coat. So that was very inspirational to Kurt. And that set him apart from the rest of the cast as well, where our like officers and scientists are based on military wear, and they're based on like, they're slightly less practical for work, like hard labor, but they are the like intellectuals, and it's their job to keep order and do research. So they're kind of very prim and proper, associated with the landborn, and like decorum is very important to them. And then the sailors are much more practical. They're a lot more similar to the actual like costume of the expeditions that they would have had at the time. They'll have these overalls that are based on fishing overalls, where the intention of them is to keep the water out and that they're waterproof and they have to stand up to hard work. But they also have like a range of raincoats and sweaters and stuff that I tried to make look handmade. And a lot of them, specifically the brothers, like they did their own haircuts because they wouldn't have been able to go and get their haircut. So that was kind of really important to their look.
Our initial references were of course drawing heavily from the Shackleton expedition, the Scots expedition, and a variety of other expeditions. But as we were setting the game in a fantasy setting that was sort of historically adjacent, if you will, we set out very early on to design its own identity. And in doing so, it was important that the art direction of the game didn't only serve an aesthetic purpose that reinforced the narrative and the story and the setting of the game, but it also needed to have a utilitarian purpose of making it clear what the mechanics were, who the characters are, and so that at a glance the player can process the correct information that they need to have that can then translate into their intention playing the game.
Initial differentiation between the crew was that we would have landborn and saltborn, and where landborn are sort of associated with the like slightly more upper crust. So they're blue, it's a very military color, it's a very expensive color for the time, so it's kind of like a status symbol, whereas the sailors are green and it's more associated with nature and it's a more muted color in comparison. Kurt wears this big red jumper, which is why the Scouts became red, because it's a very luscious, lavish color. It's supposed to be like a glimpse at his like higher status, even though he's got a very muted grey coat, and then red became the color for the Scouts as well to associate them with him. And our civilians became sort of like browns and yellows because they're more focused with their personalities, and it just kind of ended up working quite well to differentiate them from officers and people who had other jobs. Where Cordell is brown because it's a very natural colour, and she's specifically trying to disassociate herself with the landborn folk. Hunt's coat is supposed to look very scraggly and like it might not be his coat, where he's got, I don't know if it's like obvious, but his design is that he's got quite a small head and small hands and then this big massive coat. It's supposed to imply that it's not his coat and that he might have stolen it, or his intentions are not initially super clear. He's hiding something from you. Whether or not that's good or bad isn't necessarily clear. And then his deserters to imply how loyal they are specifically to him. They wear very similar wear. And again, their colour is a mix between blue and green to imply they are employed by the Landborn and they are working, in theory, in the interests of the Landborn, but they're more accustomed to the sea and that is where they're at home. Ooh, Templeton. Templeton is one of the characters that we kind of based on an actor, where some of them have faces that were a little bit difficult to comprehend initially. So Templeton's face is based slightly on Peter Cushing's face because we wanted those like high cheekbones, and everything about him is narrow and rigid and stoic because he's very concerned with keeping up appearances and making sure that everything is very like by the book, straightforward. He has a specific job that needs to get done and he wants to keep you in line. He's also judging you all of the time, so his default expression's like a little bit mean, but he's the one that is super representative of the Landborn as a concept, and he very much embodies their values, which have a lot to do with being civilized and being forward-thinking in terms of science and anti-superstition. Grimly and Junior were designed as a pair because we knew from the start that they were going to be brothers. So part of the challenge was making sure that they looked related, but also that you could tell them apart. Part of that later became a prop thing where, you know, Grimly's holding an accordion, so that's Grimly, and then Junior's holding the pot, so that's Junior. But also it was really important to get across that their personalities are different. So they have different thresholds for when they will start accepting the player because they are very loyal to Captain Hunt. Where Grimly is intended to look super closed off, and that's reflected in his body language where he like has his arms folded, he doesn't really look at you directly, whereas Junior is much more open and interested in the player even if they don't initially take them on as a leader. Kasia is one of our civilians, so she's not super accustomed to life on a ship or life on the ice. But she has got a job to do and she wants to do it really well. She's super passionate about photography and about journalism and about telling her story, so a lot of her design has to do with her role. Kasia is young because the whole point of her character is that she's very forward-thinking, and like in association with that, she's got quite a modern haircut for the time, kind of 1920s, and her camera as well has some older elements because it's just more visually interesting than what cameras really looked like at the time, which was little boxes. But it also has some futuristic elements that weren't invented at the time, like the flashbulb, but that's just to get across that she's not particularly concerned for rules of superstition or of civilization, and she's more sort of super focused on the truth. Whatever that ends up being, she has no intention of obfuscating it.
As soon as we were able to have faces to all of the crew, it was then fairly straightforward for us to start to imagine what the relationships between all of the characters are, what the relationships are between the background cast and sort of the core characters. And the art by Jess and by Katie unlocked the characterization of the cast effectively. And watching them grow over the course of development was an absolute joy and a pleasure.
Something that might be really obvious about the game is that the background style and the character styles are quite different, which we can get away with because of the precedent set by animation in general, with the realistic painterly backgrounds and then the stylized characters. But the reason that the characters look that way is because we thought that it was really important that they were characterful and that their personalities were really clear and their emotions were really clear. So while the first attempts were pretty realistic and trying to be really serious, we've discovered that that was not the right move after all. Stylizing was really helpful for the number of emotes, and it was also helpful for whenever we had a character artist join, because I then had to learn how to teach how I draw to another artist, which I'm sure was challenging for them.
I found this art style quite hard to emulate. Jess developed such a beautiful style for this game, but it is organic, it's natural, there's a beautiful sketchiness to it, and this was an absolute challenge to recreate. I think I managed it fairly well, through Jess's guidance, of course.
My origin is in animation, so that was very useful whenever it came to designing the poses, because we knew from the beginning that emotes were going to feature quite heavily in the game, even whenever it was a different game design. So the poses and the acting and the sketching became an opportunity to figure out what their personalities were. So while they had designs that were kind of functional, kind of personality at that point, people weren't going to get attached to how they look unless they are acting in a certain way. So We even had this experience where with Nolly's design originally, one of our artists, Ethan, didn't like him, just based purely on his description and his role in the story. But then whenever we started adding different expressions and different emotes, Ethan was like, oh, okay, I like this character now. So we learned that that was something that we could use to, sounds bad, emotionally hijack the player, where we could sort of really lean into the fact that the game is not just pure resource based. The point is that your decisions are affecting people, so you have to look at those people and see their reactions to how you're behaving. So that functions mechanically as well as aesthetically, because then you know you made a bad choice if someone makes a bad expression of what you just did.
Like Jess, I come from an animation background. This led to me creating the emotes almost like animation keys. I tended to jump between emotes to have a consistency between them. Originally, emotes were approached in sets. We would have various key poses for each character, and with each set we would have a range of facial expressions to suit hopefully a variety of situations. As production continued, this was more narrowed down to custom emotes for each scenario, and this streamlined our process much better.
Earlier on in development, as we were originally playing around with visualizing the setting, back when the game was effectively more of a visual novel, we had a larger focus on beautifully rendered backgrounds, and very early on we had our character design locked in for the core cast. That was working, but as we decided to introduce more mechanical complexity to the game, we were running into some scope issues in terms of how we'd organize the production of the artwork, and we needed to make sure that we were landing on something that wasn't only fundamentally in service of the mechanics, but was also producible to the extent that we could create an entire game's worth of content, and the assets needed to be constructed in a way in which there was maneuverability in how they were deployed in engine as the game changed shape and evolved over time. And the moment of inspiration that struck me personally, at least, was coming across this old image of a depiction of the Shackleton expedition as a ship-in-the-bottle diorama. And it kind of created this sense of, in a game where you're supposed to be the leader and you're meant to be in charge of this large group of people, we wanted you to not only have a personal perspective face-to-face with these characters, with our design pillar of decisions have a face, but we wanted to find a way for the player to, for lack of a better phrase, conceptualize the entire game state. And going back to this ship-in-a-bottle diorama, it actually just sparked a moment of inspiration. We decided to do some tests in terms of deploying an isometric pipeline. And I think it was a sort of nice opportunity to go for a classical art style approach that wasn't only more performant and healthier for the scope of the game's production, but also kind of thematically and artistically sort of fit the setting. And we did some tests and it started to work really well, and it completely opened up the mechanical design of the game.
My favourite character to draw was Cordell. Cordell is my favourite character overall, actually, mainly because I got to draw her with a dog. Originally, Stanberry was the only dog that existed in art form for a while, until we began to create isometric emotes. At that point, the entire dog team was created, all 14 of them, with Stanberry being the 15th. Creating the isometric emotes compared to conversation emotes was quite challenging at times. The conversation emotes are obviously much higher resolution, higher fidelity, whereas the isometric emotes, they're seen at a much smaller scale, and they require much less detail, which ironically was more difficult to create. It took a bit of experimentation between Jess and myself to work out how detailed these should be. We knew we wanted to show the effects of the environment on our characters, particularly in later stages of the game. To do this, we damaged their clothing, we messed up their hair, we made their clothes less clean, less pristine, and we added snow and frost peppering over their clothes. We wanted our characters to feel like they had been affected as a consequence of the journey that they'd been on. The environment has had a profound effect on these people, both physically and emotionally, and we wanted this to be represented in our character's appearance.
The ship is interesting because it's one of our only connections to the world outside of the ice, where obviously we can do some world building through how characters talk and what they wear, but the ship is like a piece of architecture almost. The game is sort of implied to be around the tail end of the industrial age, so we have a ship that is supposed to be an antique. So it's inspired by 1800s kind of vessels and old whaling ships at the time, because the Endurance from the Shackleton expedition was a whaling ship, so that was our main inspiration there. But then we also wanted to retrofit it with technology. We're a bit vague about the kind of technology, but it's sort of something that isn't designed for purpose, but it's been adjusted and like forced into the role that it has to take on, which is why the expedition doesn't go super well, because the shape of the ship is why it gets stuck on the ice, which was the same as the Endurance. But we took inspiration from like naval vessels from the 1800s, and then we got a little bit wackier. I looked at some Final Fantasy stuff and some Dishonored for the like steampunk industrial aesthetic, and then also for the like shape of the sails on the back of the ship. And also the long ships. I took the Norse inspiration that we were using for the characters themselves and applied it to the ship as well, where I just really wanted to put a dragon on it.
Thanks for taking the time to listen about the crew and the ship. You can join us next time, and we're going to talk about the environment design, the effects, and how we designed the UI for the game as well.